The early morning mist clung to Arthur Penhaligon's vegetable patch like a lover's embrace. Arthur, oblivious to any romantic notions, hummed a tuneless melody as he pinched off dead leaves from his prize-winning tomato plants. The earthy scent of damp soil filled his lungs, a familiar comfort as he wore his usual attire. Faded denim overalls, patched at the knees, and a worn-out flannel shirt several sizes too big. Dirt smudged his calloused hands, a testament to his honest labor. His small cottage, nestled at the edge of Oakhaven, was a testament to his simple needs. Inside, a single room served as kitchen, dining area, and living space. Upstairs, a cramped bedroom held a narrow bed and a lifetime of memories. Arthur was a man of routine. After tending his garden, he'd cycle into town, delivering vegetables to Mrs. Gable's bakery and Mr. Abernathy's greengrocer. He enjoyed the quiet solitude of his work, the meditative rhythm of planting, weeding, and harvesting. Conversation wasn't his forte. He preferred the company of rustling leaves and chirping birds to the chatter of the townsfolk. Today, however, the air in Oakhaven buzzed with an unusual energy as Arthur wheeled his bicycle past the town square. He noticed clusters of people whispering, their faces a mixture of excitement and morbid curiosity. He overheard snippets. Rutherford, dead this morning. Million. Montgomery Rutherford, the wealthiest man in Oakhaven, had passed away. Arthur knew of him only as the recluse who lived in the sprawling mansion on the hill, a place he'd only ever glimpsed through the gaps in the towering hedges. That Rutherford's wealth was legendary, a source of both envy and fascination in the small town. Mrs. Gable's bakery. The whispers intensified. Imagine, Mrs. Gable said, kneading dough with unusual vigor. All that money. Who do you think he'll leave it to? Old man Hemlock, perched on his usual stool, puffed out his chest. Probably some fancy charity. Rutherford never cared much for Oakhaven. Agnes Plumtree, the town gossip, leaned in conspiratorially. I heard he had a secret family, somewhere in Europe. A wife, maybe even children. Arthur, overwhelmed by the noise and speculation, deposited his basket of tomatoes and retreated as quickly as possible. Mumbling a hurried goodbye, he felt a pang of sympathy for the unknown heirs. Whoever they might be, he couldn't imagine the weight of such a fortune, the responsibility that came with it. He preferred the simple satisfaction of a ripe tomato, the quiet beauty of a blooming sunflower. Back in his garden, the mist had lifted, revealing a world bathed in golden sunlight. Arthur knelt down, his fingers tracing the delicate veins of a lettuce leaf. That he was content. Let the Rutherfords and their millions remain a world away. He had his garden, his vegetables, and the quiet peace of Oakhaven. For now, that was enough. An unexpected invitation. The late afternoon sun warmed Arthur's back as he pruned his prize-winning roses. Their velvety petals, a riot of crimson and gold, perfumed the air. A comforting counterpoint to the earthy scent of the soil clinging to his calloused hands. A sleek, black automobile pulled up to the gate. Disturbing the tranquility, a uniformed driver emerged, holding a crisp, cream-colored envelope embossed with a Gothic R. Mr. Arthur Penhaligon? The driver's voice was clipped and formal, a stark contrast to the neighborly greetings Arthur was used to. Arthur straightened, wiping his hands on his worn trousers. That's me. The driver presented the envelope with a practiced flourish. You are formally invited to the reading of the will of the late Montgomery Rutherford, Esquire, to be held at Rutherford Manor this Saturday at 10 o'clock sharp. Arthur stared at the invitation, his brow furrowed. Montgomery Rutherford. He hadn't known the man. He'd seen the imposing Rutherford Manor from a distance, its gray stone walls a world apart from his humble cottage, but he'd never imagined setting foot inside, much less being invited to a will reading. Later, leaning over the garden fence, he showed the invitation to Mrs. Higgins, her eyes widening behind her spectacles. Montgomery Rutherford? But Arthur, you never knew him. This is unprecedented. She puffed out her cheeks, a sure sign she was deep in thought. Perhaps a clerical error? Though that's stationary. It's the real deal. Arthur shrugged. I haven't the faintest idea. I suppose I should go, just in case. Seems the proper thing to do. He felt a knot of unease tightening in his stomach. That he was a simple man, content with his garden and his books. This foray into the world of wealthy estates and legal documents felt utterly foreign. Meanwhile, 20 miles away in a penthouse overlooking the city, Clarissa Rutherford Hayes paced impatiently. News of the will reading had reached her through her network of carefully cultivated social connections. The invitation was expected, of course she was, after all, Montgomery's only living niece. The Rutherford fortune was practically hers. She'd already mentally redecorated the manor, planned the charity galas, envisioned herself at the apex of society. This was her due. That old fool couldn't possibly have left anything to anyone else. Could he? She murmured, her reflection staring back from the polished surface of her grand piano. The thought sent a shiver of icy apprehension down her spine. The possibility, however remote, that her carefully constructed future could be snatched away was unbearable. The Rutherford mansion. The wrought iron gates loomed, easily twice Arthur's height, and glinted menacingly even under the gentle afternoon sun that a long, curving driveway, impeccably graveled, stretched towards a building that could only be described as palatial. The Rutherford mansion. He swallowed, the knot in his stomach tightening his invitation, clutched damply in his hand, felt ludicrous. He was a gardener, for heaven's sake. What was he doing here? He parked his battered pickup truck a discreet distance from the gleaming vehicles already lining the drive, a Rolls-Royce, several sleek black sedans. He smoothed down his best, but clearly inadequate, tweed jacket and made his way towards the imposing oak front doors inside. The air hummed with hushed conversation and the clinking of crystal. A chandelier, vast and glittering like a frozen waterfall, dominated the entrance hall. Polished marble floors reflected the light, amplifying the already overwhelming sense of opulence. Arthur felt a flush creep up his neck. He was acutely aware of the mud clinging to his work boots, the faint scent of earth clinging to his clothes. That a sea of impeccably dressed individuals, all radiating an air of entitlement, filled the space. Women in elegant dresses, their necks adorned with glittering jewels, men in tailored suits, their faces etched with the same expectant expressions. They were like birds of paradise, and he, Arthur Penhaligon, was a particularly drab sparrow that had somehow wandered into their gilded cage. A woman detached herself from a group near the grand staircase, tall and slender, with an icy blonde bob and eyes that could freeze water. She glided towards him. Her dress, a shimmering emerald green, looked like it cost more than he earned in a year. "And you are?" she asked, her voice crisp and sharp. Arthur cleared his throat. "Arthur Penhaligon. That I received an invitation." He fumbled for the card, his fingers suddenly clumsy. She raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "Penhaligon? I don't believe I've heard that name mentioned in connection with Uncle Montgomery. Are you quite certain you're in the right place?" Her gaze swept over him, assessing him with blatant disdain, lingering on his worn jacket and calloused hands. He could practically hear her unspoken judgment. "Utterly insignificant." "Yes, ma'am," Arthur mumbled, finally producing the invitation. She took it, her manicured nails clicking against the cardstock. She scanned it quickly, her lips pursing into a thin line. "Well?" she said, handing it back with a dismissive flick of her wrist. "I suppose there's been some sort of mistake. You'll find the refreshments in the West Wing. Don't touch anything valuable." She turned and rejoined her group, leaving Arthur feeling smaller and more out of place than ever. The reading begins. Mr. Hawthorne cleared his throat, the resonant sound amplified by the drawing room's unnatural quiet. His spectacles, threatening to slide off his nose, framed eyes that scanned the room before he unfurled the precisely folded legal document. The air, heavy with the ghosts of fortunes past and simmering resentments, seemed to stagnate. "The last will and testament of Montgomery Rutherford, Esquire," he intoned, his voice a dry, formal pronouncement. He began, each clause a deliberate weight dropped into the tense atmosphere. Bequests flowed to the local hospital, a generous sum. To the botanical gardens, a substantial offering. A smaller purse earmarked for historical landmarks. That a low murmur traveled through the kin gathered. Clarissa Rutherford Hayes, perched imperiously on a chair upholstered in silk, shifted, her ruby necklace flashing like a captured flame. "To my loyal housekeeper, Mrs. Higgins, I bequeath," Hawthorne continued, detailing a handsome sum set aside for her retirement. That a fresh wave of hushed tones washed over the room. Arthur Penhaligon, tucked into the shadows of an armchair, felt increasingly insignificant. A trespasser in a land not his own. Tension coiled through him, a constricting serpent in his gut. Then came the family legacies. "To my nephew, Cecil Rutherford, I entrust my collection of antique firearms. A glint of satisfaction lit Cecil's features, his meticulously groomed mustache bristling. To my cousin, Eleanor Finch, goes my collection of first edition novels. A rare smile touched Eleanor's perpetually severe face, but Arthur's name remained conspicuously absent as he straightened, striving for composure. Though heat flooded his cheeks, the collective gaze of the Rutherfords descended, a predatory assessment of his value, or rather, its perceived lack. Clarissa Rutherford Hayes offered a delicate, yet pointed cough. "Really, Mr. Hawthorne?" she purred, her voice a silken blade. "Is that quite all?" One might assume dear Uncle Montgomery had overlooked someone. A ripple of suppressed laughter, sharp and unkind, coursed through the room. Arthur averted his eyes, focusing on the intricate weave of the Persian rug beneath his feet. He felt exposed. Like a common pebble on a beach of polished jewels, he was an outsider. A fact they were keen to impress upon him. The sound of someone. A stout woman with a cascade of chins, snorting loudly echoed through the stillness, the final, bitter draught in his cup of humiliation. The sealed envelope. "There's one final matter," Mr. Hawthorne announced, a renewed firmness returning to his voice. He adjusted his tie. A telltale twitch Arthur hadn't registered before. The air, already heavy with barely veiled ambition, seemed to coalesce into something almost tangible. Clarissa Rutherford Hayes, who had been subtly rearranging the silverware by her plate, perhaps appraising its worth, froze. A flash of pique crossed her features, instantly replaced with a brittle, practiced smile. "Another edition, Mr. Hawthorne?" Uncle Theodore was certainly meticulous. Hawthorne cleared his throat. "Not an edition, Mrs. Rutherford Hayes. Rather, a concluding provision." From his briefcase he extracted a pristine white envelope, its red wax seal embossed with an unreadable crest. In the clinical conference room, it appeared strikingly out of place, almost stagey. "This," Hawthorne stated, holding it up, "names the ultimate contingent beneficiary, should unforeseen circumstances befall the primary beneficiaries designated in the will. This individual will inherit Mr. Theodore Rutherford's entire estate." A collective intake of breath swept the room. Unforeseen circumstances? What could that entail? A persistent ache began to bloom behind Arthur's eyes that he hadn't even absorbed the initial shock of his own inclusion, and now this curveball that it felt like a further act of dispossession, a fallback for someone considered more deserving than those already recognized. But who on earth could it be? A woman with tightly curled gray hair, vaguely recalled by Arthur as Cousin Mildred, blurted out. "Surely it's a mere formality," Clarissa countered, her tone laced with its usual imperiousness. "A safeguard against some cataclysmic event. Scarcely relevant, I'd wager." Yet the subtle drumming of her fingers against the polished tabletop belied her composure. Arthur observed the Rutherford clan, their faces studies and expectation and thinly disguised avarice. He felt like a spectator at a theater, a silent figure with no part in the unfolding drama. The mahogany surface shimmered beneath the fluorescent lights, reflecting their taut visages. He wondered if the envelope contained the designation of a distant connection, a secret progeny, or perhaps even a philanthropic institution. Anything seemed more likely than himself. Hawthorne returned the envelope to his briefcase with deliberate care, the click of the latch amplifying the sudden hush. "The contents of this envelope will only be disclosed if absolutely imperative. Until such time, it remains sealed." He offered a small, insincere smile that did little to allay anyone's anxieties. The unexpected air. The air in the Rutherford library thickened, each breath a shallow, anticipatory thing to Mr. Hawthorne. A man whose face had always seemed carved from granite, held the sealed envelope aloft, the firelight glinting off its pristine surface. He moved with a deliberate slowness that was almost cruel, prolonging the unbearable suspense. The rustle of the paper as he finally broke the seal was amplified in the oppressive silence, a sound like dry leaves skittering across a tombstone. He unfolded the document within, his gaze sweeping across the assembled faces, each a mask of carefully constructed composure or poorly veiled greed. Clarissa sat perfectly upright, her hands clasped in her lap, a single bead of sweat trickling down her temple, betraying the cool exterior. Arthur Penhaligon, tucked away in the corner by the dusty globe, felt smaller than ever, an unwelcome guest at a feast he hadn't been invited to. Mr. Hawthorne cleared his throat. the sound echoing through the room. "The last will and testament of Montgomery Rutherford," he began, his voice resonating with legal gravitas. "Names a sole inheritor to his entire estate, encompassing all properties, assets, and holdings. That inheritor is—" He paused, allowing the tension to stretch to its breaking point. "Arthur Penhaligon." The silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum of disbelief. Then, a collective gasp ripped through the room, a wave of shocked air that ruffled the curtains and made the candles flicker wildly. Clarissa's composure cracked. Her fingers tightened around each other until her knuckles gleamed white. She stared at Mr. Hawthorne, her lips moving silently, as if trying to formulate a question that wouldn't give away her rising panic. Arthur remained frozen, a statue carved from bewilderment. His eyes, usually downcast, were wide, darting from face to face. Seeking some explanation in the sea of stunned expressions, he felt a prickling sensation on his skin, a sense of unreality washing over him. This couldn't be right. Arthur Penhaligon, the quiet, unremarkable bookkeeper, heir to a fortune? It was absurd. A cruel joke played by a universe with a twisted sense of humor. He wanted to speak, to protest, to say there had been some mistake. But the words wouldn't form. He was trapped in a bubble of unreality, watching the drama unfold around him as if it were a play, and he, unknowingly, had been cast in the leading role. Rutherford's letter. "There must be some mistake," Clarissa Rutherford Hayes said, her voice a cool, precise blade slicing through the stunned silence of the room. She hadn't shouted, hadn't even raised her voice, but the force of her disbelief was palpable. "Arthur Penhaligon? Inheriting everything? It's absurd." Arthur, still reeling from Hawthorne's announcement, could only stammer, I don't understand." The plush carpet seemed to sway beneath his feet, that he felt a bead of sweat trickle down his temple. "Understand?" Clarissa echoed, a flicker of something sharp and dangerous in her eyes. "I think it's quite clear what's happened. You've somehow manipulated my uncle. Or worse, perhaps influenced him in his final days." The implication hung heavy in the air, thick with suspicion. A murmur rippled through the gathered relatives, a chorus of discontent. Hawthorne cleared his throat, the sound surprisingly loud in the tense atmosphere. "Mrs. Rutherford Hayes, I assure you, everything was conducted according to Mr. Rutherford's express wishes, and under my strictest supervision. Furthermore—" He paused, reaching into his briefcase. "I have here another document. A letter, written and signed by Mr. Rutherford himself, explaining his decision." He unfolded the crisp paper with deliberate slowness, the rustle amplifying the anticipation. Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs. What could Rutherford possibly have written? Hawthorne began to read, his voice steady and unwavering. "To whom it may concern, and especially to my family. I understand that my will may come as a surprise. I want to explain my reasoning to Arthur Penhaligon. I saw something rare, genuine kindness. Not the polite smiles and hollow condolences I often receive, but true, unadulterated human decency." Arthur's mind flashed back to a scorching afternoon, the sun beating down on cracked asphalt. Rutherford, stranded on the side of the road with his vintage Bentley sputtering uselessly. Arthur, despite being already late for his shift at the bakery, had stopped. He remembered the cloying smell of gasoline, the heat radiating from the engine, the way Rutherford's face, usually stern, had softened with gratitude as Arthur managed to coax the engine back to life. "Most people wouldn't have bothered," Rutherford had said, his voice gruff but sincere. "Thank you, young man. You're a good sort." He tried to press money into Arthur's hand. Arthur refused. Hawthorne continued reading. "Arthur asked for nothing in return. He simply helped. That simple act showed me more about his character than a lifetime of polite conversation ever could. My family. They've always been interested in what I could give them. Arthur is different. He doesn't want anything from me. He deserves everything." The letter was signed with a flourish, "Rupert Rutherford." The room fell silent again, this time weighted not with suspicion, but with stunned disbelief. Clarissa's carefully constructed composure seemed to crack, just slightly, around the edges. The color drained from her face, leaving her skin unnaturally pale. Arthur stared at Hawthorne, then at the letter, then back at the faces of the bewildered and resentful Rutherford relatives. He still didn't understand. A gardener's inheritance. Arthur's gaze remained fixed on Mr. Grimshaw, the solicitor, his expression carefully neutral, though disbelief gnawed at him that a life dedicated to his modest garden, a parsimonious existence, and now this, Rutherford's entire estate, the majestic manor perched above the coastline, the sprawling, untamed grounds, the sheer, staggering wealth that it felt like a cruel jest, a prank spun from some mischievous fancy. He excused himself, a mumbled pretext about needing air escaping his lips, and lurched from the stifling office. The afternoon sun bore down, yet a prickling coldness invaded him. He lowered himself onto a nearby bench, the smooth, cool stone a jarring contrast to the turmoil raging within his. Life had been a study in simplicity. The quiet reward of nurturing growth, the measured cadence of the spade, the rich aroma of turned earth. Now, he was charged with managing. What? A domain he never coveted. He pictured Rutherford, the old gentleman whose eyes held a universe of untold narratives, eyes often shadowed by a profound loneliness. He'd often visit Arthur's patch, ostensibly to admire the roses, but Arthur suspected he simply yearned for companionship. Their talks would stretch for hours, Rutherford recounting tales of his globe-trotting, adventure-laden past, Arthur offering observations on the shifting seasons and the local avifauna's antics. "You possess a kind soul, Arthur," Rutherford had once remarked, seemingly out of the blue. A rare commodity these days. Arthur had dismissed it, flustered, but the words now echoed, resonant. Was this the explanation? The rationale behind this preposterous, overwhelming inheritance? The burden of it settled upon him, far heavier than any sack of compost he'd ever hefted. Visions flashed through his mind. The library, a mausoleum of leather-bound volumes layered with dust, the grounds, a wilderness of neglect that he considered his village, grappling with dwindling resources, the community center desperately needing renovation, the children deprived of essential athletic equipment. That a notion began to burgeon, tentatively at first, like a delicate shoot emerging from the soil. He wouldn't fritter it away. He wouldn't betray Rutherford's faith. He would leverage this unexpected boon to revitalize the community that had always been his anchor. It wouldn't be simple. He was merely a gardener, not a magnate, not a benefactor. But he possessed a kind soul, and perhaps that would suffice as a beginning. The chill began to ebb, supplanted by a nascent resolve. The sun felt a touch warmer now, the air crisper. He had a garden to cultivate. After all, a truly monumental one, the legacy of kindness. The murmurs in the library were like a hive disturbed. Arthur, still reeling from Mr. Abernathy's pronouncements, cleared his throat. He felt a tremor run through him, a strange cocktail of fear and determination. I want to honor Mr. Rutherford's memory, and use this inheritance to do good." He paused, gathering his courage. "I intend to establish a foundation. The Rutherford Foundation at IT will focus on supporting local charities, especially those that provide food and shelter to the homeless and offer educational opportunities to underprivileged children." A vision flashed in his mind, children's faces, bright with hope, not shadowed by hunger or despair. That was what he wanted. Clarissa Rutherford Hayes scoffed, the sound sharp and brittle as breaking glass. "A foundation? Are you serious? You, a gardener, running a foundation?" Her carefully applied makeup seemed to crack under the strain of her incredulity. Arthur ignored her, pushing on. "And the mansion? It shouldn't be sold off or turned into some luxury hotel. That Mr. Rutherford loved his garden. That I'd like to see it become a public garden, open to everyone. A place of beauty, of peace." He imagined families strolling through the rose gardens, children laughing amongst the fountains, the scent of lavender and honeysuckle filling the air. The initial shock began to morph into something else. Some of the townspeople present, people who knew Arthur, started to nod, a slow wave of understanding rippling through the room. They had seen his kindness, his quiet generosity. For years, this wasn't about money for Arthur. It was about making a difference. In the weeks that followed, Arthur did exactly as he promised. The Rutherford Foundation was established, and the mansion was transformed. The gardens bloomed as never before, tended with loving care by Arthur and a team of dedicated gardeners. The aroma of blossoming wisteria drifted on the breeze, beckoning visitors from miles around. The first grants from the foundation were awarded, providing warm meals, safe shelter, and much-needed school supplies to those in need. The town buzzed with a renewed sense of hope. Clarissa, watching from afar, was forced to confront the reality of Arthur's actions. The whispers of admiration, the smiles of gratitude directed his way, chipped away at her carefully constructed facade of superiority. One cool autumn evening, she approached Arthur in the rose garden. The setting sun cast long shadows, painting the flowers in hues of gold and crimson. "Arthur," she said, her voice surprisingly small. I owe you an apology. We all do. We misjudged you terribly. We were ashamed to be associated with you, when we should have been learning from you." She extended a hand, hesitantly. "Is there anything we can do to help?"